earlier, we're continuing in the book of Acts. We've been looking at the book of Acts for a while. We're going to continue in this, and today is no exception. We're looking at the origins of the early church. We're looking at where the church really came from. The book of Acts outlines that. It's a New Testament book that gives the history of where we came from. And as I've said most of the weeks of this series, I'll say again that we're not just simply looking at the history of the church so that we know where we're coming from, but also so that we're getting indication of where we're going. As we look at this church and we see what was happening among them, we get a glimpse of who we have the potential to be if we allow ourselves to be the church the way God intended us to be. And so we're looking at them with this sense of knowing this is who we have the potential to become. See, this is why this is really important for us, because I think oftentimes we look at history and we sort of think things were so different that it doesn't really apply to us. But when you think about the early church, the environment that the gospel was growing in, the place where the gospel was going out, where these churches were getting started, the reality is that it was a very pluralistic culture, meaning that people had all sorts of ideologies about who God is and how they would make sense or meaning of their lives, how they could find joy or purpose. There's all sorts of fundamental thinking that is out there that people have about how to find life in this life. And the gospel is expanding, it's going out and going forward in a culture where there were all these differing ideas, different opinions, very much like our culture today. I think this is encouraging for some sense, because for us today, we might look at what we believe about the Bible or how we understand God or Jesus, and we think that's sort of a minority view, that's not a common view, and that makes us unique. The truth is it makes us more like the early church. They were in a culture that did not believe like them, and yet this story is filled with stories of individuals who were beginning to believe Jesus, and their ideologies were shifting and they were changing in their thinking. We see people, the church growing as more and more people began to follow Jesus. By the way, the church grew. It wasn't just that they grew because people that were Christians had babies, by the way. I think that's important to know. It wasn't just that they, went forth and multiplied, and so that's why they grew. They grew because men and women that were living life one particular way suddenly made a change of direction and began to follow Jesus. That's what's remarkable about this. In fact, there's a word that describes this experience of individuals thinking one way or following one ideology and then shifting and following another, and that word is conversion. And that's what we're seeing in the book of Acts. When people began to follow Jesus, there is a conversion. People were being converted. There's really no better word to describe this, right? They believed one thing, they lived one way, and then suddenly after this moment, they now believe something different, and they live differently as a result of what they believe. And so there's a conversion taking place. They're no longer the same. They might look the same, there might be nuances of similarity, but there's something different about them. Converted. Now that word, as I say that, probably causes for some of you in the room a little bit of anxiety. And that's because there's a couple of different ideas in our culture today around this idea of conversion. Some people truly believe that calling for conversion is sort of a primitive Christian practice. That in order for us to pursue conversion the way that people have previously thought of it is really sort of an antiquated model of Christianity. That's like old school Jesus, right? Not like new intellectual articulate Jesus. This is an old thing. In fact, we oftentimes in our culture think that to ask people to convert is wrong. We think we should respect people, and by respecting people, we respect their intellect. We don't dishonor them by asking them to convert. We just trust their sensibilities and let them move forward with that. So do we really need to talk about conversion in today's day and age? So that's one level of awkwardness around this word. I also think that even in the church, there's awkwardness around this, because when we think of the word conversion, people being converted, oftentimes there's an ideal in place of what that would look like. There's a picture that we get. There's a story that would be told around a conversion. And for some of us in the room, our stories aren't that remarkable. We don't have these pinpoint times when we suddenly were radically different people because of Jesus. And maybe you, like me, spent significant time around the church and around the Bible, and you had some exposure to Christianity, but you don't really have this moment that you can look at and say, boy, I was radically different because of that. And so because of that, you think to yourself, well, is this conversion idea really that legitimate? Well, if we put this question to the scriptures and we say, well, what does the Bible say about conversion? The answer is a resounding, yes, it's still relevant and very much a part of the Christian experience. In fact, just a couple of examples. In Matthew chapter 18, this is Jesus speaking, and Jesus says, unless you are converted, you will not enter into, you will not experience the kingdom of God. Jesus himself used these words. In the book of John, in John chapter 3, Jesus says, unless an individual is born again, they will not experience the kingdom of God. Unless you are rebirthed, reborn, this transformation. Now, both of these are different words. This word converted, this idea of being born again, they're different words, but they really describe the same experience. One from our perspective, one from God's perspective. Conversion is what we do in the process. The new birth is something that God does, but both of those words describe something happening to a person, and they're no longer who they used to be. Their ideologies change. Their philosophy around life changes. Where they find meaning is now different. Life is different because of this experience that Jesus himself is describing for individuals. There's a change that takes place. So something happens in our life. The challenge is this, is what does that actually look like? Because when you read the Bible, what you'll discover as you dig into the stories of conversion, what you start to see is a variety of differences on how people are actually converted. You have certain stories where it's very visible, very public. There are very dramatic stories. And then you have other stories where it's very invisible. It's behind the scenes. You have stories like the individual Nicodemus who comes to Jesus under the cover of night, and his conversion experience doesn't seem to draw much attention. Then you have the ones like we're going to look at today, Saul, the conversion of Saul, where it is this iconic, huge story. It's dramatic and seems very spectacular. And so really the question is, well, what does conversion actually look like? Because of all the variance, we have to be careful that we don't prescribe and say, well, this is what this is supposed to be. That we don't create an architecture of sorts and say, this is how a person should look before and after they come to Jesus. This is what their experience should actually be like if they were really converted. Like, we got to be careful to not develop a pattern and make everyone look the same. But at the same time, we cannot deny the reality that conversion is a part of following Jesus. So you say, why do we bring this up? I bring this up because today, this story that we're looking at is one of the more significant conversions in the scriptures. It is this iconic story of Saul, later known as Paul, who is converted and everything changes for him. And it would be incredibly easy for all of us in the room to look at his conversion and say, well, this is what it's supposed to look like. Like, it's supposed to be dramatic and public, and it's supposed to have all these characteristics. And unless you've had that experience, then you might want to question whether or not you really are a Jesus follower. So there's that tendency. Or, on the other hand, you could dismiss it because of the nature of it. You could say this was never meant to be normative, that the Apostle Paul's conversion is an outlier. His story really is unique, and so we don't really need to see this sort of thing happen in our life, and so we can dismiss it on that hand. But I want to present a third option today. That while some of the details that are specific to Paul may be just specific to him, there is a process that we're going to see him move through this morning that is consistent with other conversion stories in the scriptures and in the history of Christians throughout the church. There's certain elements, there are things that he experiences, there are ingredients, if you will, to his conversion that can be translated or transferred to anyone who has truly shifted their faith into Jesus and his gospel. There's some things that we see here. In fact, as we move through this today, many of you may find yourself actually like identifying and saying, oh man, I remember that. Like that's my experience. That was certainly my process. Others of you today, you actually may find yourself in the middle of this process. You may find yourself somewhere in the middle of these ingredients, and you find yourself wrestling a bit with what's happening in your life and your understanding of God. In either case, this is a story that has remarkable reference to the time and place that we're in right now. So, if you have a Bible, I want you to open to Acts chapter, we're studying Acts. Acts chapter 9, we're going to start reading in verse 1. So as you're opening to that, a little bit of background before we get to these ingredients of conversion, a little background, just so you get the sequence of events. Chapter 7 closed with the murder of an individual named Stephen. Stephen was a guy identified in Acts chapter 6 to help serve some of the Hellenistic widows. He was the first Christian to be persecuted and die for his faith, and that happened at the hands of Jewish leaders. And the chapter 7 closes by saying that this individual named Saul was holding the cloaks of those that stoned Stephen during his death. And so Saul, this individual we're going to read about, was there in chapter 7. Chapter 8 opens up with a persecution led by Saul that caused Christians in Jerusalem to be spread into Samaria. And as a result of that, the last couple of weeks we've been looking at these remarkable stories of people who were overwhelmed by the gospel, conversion stories, people who began to believe in Jesus, people who were believing because of Christians who were spread there as a result of Saul's persecution, he and his friends. That last week ended with the Ethiopian eunuch being baptized. Chapter 8 ends there. Then we move into chapter 9, and again we're introduced to this individual named Saul, and this is where we start to see the ingredients of true conversion. Listen to this in verse 1. It says, "But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way," that's Christianity, "men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And he said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting.'" So here we have the first of three ingredients of conversion. It begins with a collision. There's a collision. Check this out. The text says that Paul is literally knocked to the ground, right? But what is it that knocks him to the ground? Is it the light that knocks him to the ground? If so, when was the last time you saw a light so bright it knocked you to the ground? Like, oh, and you fell? Kind of unusual, right? Is it the voice? I know I've been scared by someone hiding, and maybe I've been scared and I've tripped over something and fallen to the ground. But why is he fallen to the ground? The reason that Paul is knocked to the ground was that he was having a collision with the truth. He's having a major collision with the truth. He's colliding with a God that he did not create. A God who has his own reality, and a God who is truly here, a God who is now present in front of him. And here's what we learn from this. In this moment, we discover that what Saul had constructed in his mind was a God that fit his construct of who God could be. He had the God that he wanted God to be. But his God was not the real God. How do we know this? Well, because in verse 5, it says that when the real God shows up on the scene, Saul literally says, "Who are you?" Right? This is an unknown person. He doesn't know this God. Why? Because the God that he has is a God that he had constructed, a God that he wanted, not the God that was really there in front of him. And this encounter that he has is the opposite of what he expected. When he's face to face with God, he sees this God and he's like, this isn't what I thought because I thought I knew who God was, right? He's dumbfounded. I know God and this is not within the realm of what I expected out of God. Why? Because his God was a constructed God in his own mind and his own heart. Now, I think it's probably good for us to pause just for a moment and recognize that there are some distinctives between Saul and ourselves today. First of all, he got away with wearing bathrobes and sandals way more than we ever could today, right? A little jealous of that part of his life. But secondly, people today in our culture aren't going to construct a God like Saul's God, right? They're not going to construct a God. In our culture, you ask people about who God is, and if it's a God they've constructed, they're not going to tell you about an angry God who's very demanding and very moralistic and wants you to jump through a bunch of hoops, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't construct a God. Just because it doesn't look like his doesn't mean that in our culture, and by the way, when I say people today, I'm not just saying some random group of people outside of here. I'm talking about us. I'm talking about even myself at times. Just because our construction of God and who we think he is doesn't look like Saul's does not mean we don't participate in the same thing. There are a lot of people who believe that there is a God, very genuinely and very sincerely. But when you ask them to describe their God with language, it is surprising how frequently that God is described in a way that fits very nicely and very neatly within the construct of how they believe life should work. So they describe God in terms that fit very nicely with their idea of how life should go. And so the God that they describe is a God that seems to be created out of their own heart, out of their own desires of what they want God to be. It just, God fits within our own ideas. And what you discover when you begin to ask people what they believe about God is that we just construct gods the same way that Saul constructed a God. We still construct our own ideas about God and who he is. We come up with our own ideas. We make him up in our own minds. He's a product of our own imaginations. Now, what's the problem with this? At some level, there's obviously a larger problem. You say, well, then you're like pursuing a God who may not be the real God. That's a larger issue. But on the practical level, why is this important on a practical level? And it turns out that there's so much wrong with this, but here's one example. A God that you have made is basically a projection of yourself. He's just a projection of yourself. And a God that is a projection of yourself cannot possibly help you. If he's just a figment of your own heart's imagination, then he cannot lift you out of your circumstances. If he's the God that you've constructed, he can't make you more than you already are, because he's limited by your imagination. If God is simply just a byproduct of your ideas about God, then that God can't actually change you, that God can't transform you, that God can't help you, because he's no greater than the imagination of your heart. He's limited by what you have imagined him to be. He's a figment of your imagination. He's a construction of your own heart. And what you and I need is a God who is greater than our heart's imagination. Let me just give you an example of this. A few weeks back, I went fishing over in eastern Montana with a group of other pastors to a place that's really remote, really isolated, like there's no cell phone service. Right? Which some of you have been in a place like this, right? And it's amazing how fidgety we get when we don't have our cell phones, right? Like you get a bunch of guys like me in a room together and we don't have cell phone service, and suddenly you have to start thinking and talking about things you don't want to think and talk about, right? Like I can't be distracted. And so in the middle of that, I found myself realizing in my boredom, I have to actually face myself in this. And so during this trip, I always seem to wake up early, and I have this sickness where when I have to be somewhere, I can sleep in till noon. But when I can sleep in till noon, I seem to wake up at 4:30 in the morning. Anybody else have this illness? So we're on this trip and I can sleep. We're not fishing till later in the day. And every morning I wake up early. And the first particular morning I got up and I went outside. There was this picnic bench that's outside on the patio. And I went out there, and the only person that was up was the guy cooking. And I sat down at this bench, and there's no cell phone, there's no news feed, there's nothing, right? And I'm watching the sunrise, and I've just got my Bible and my journal, and I just thought, man, you know what? I need this. I just need to sit and think and evaluate my heart and spend some time writing and reflecting. And the more I sat there, the more I began to just spew out onto these pages how disappointed I am with myself. And I was just writing all this stuff, man, I don't measure up here, and there's this I wish was different. And as I'm writing, I'm sitting there by myself and thinking about my life, and I suddenly realize I am really good at self-loathing. Really good at blaming myself and thinking negatively about myself. And I'm literally just beating myself up. And then in that moment, God just begins to speak some things to my heart. I began reading his word, and he begins to say some things that are contrary to the self-loathing that I'm wallowing in this moment. And so I start writing these things down. I'm a little embarrassed because here I am with this group of pastors, and certainly no one else feels like I feel, right? Nobody ever self-loathes, right? No one here has insecurities, right? None of us do, just me. And certainly a group of pastors. So I'm sitting there, and one of the other guys on the trip wakes up, comes down, and sits across the bench from me. And I close my journal and I hide it, and we start talking, and I'm just sitting there. And after just a couple of minutes, he begins to open up. And what he opens up about is his self-loathing and his insecurities. And he just starts sharing. And I said, man, I can't believe you're can I just share with you what I've just written this morning? And so I opened up my journal and I wrote, and we just sat there and had this, man crush sort of moment. Oh, this is so good, And next morning I wake up too early again. I go out, sit down. I'm just trying not to self-loathe. I'm just, writing in my journal, reflecting. Another guy gets up, comes downstairs, sits across the table. And again, I'm like, what are we going to talk about? And he starts talking, and guess what he starts talking about? Man, I am just so hard on myself. I don't know what it is. I never feel like I measure up. And he just starts going on. And I'm like, well, can I tell you what I wrote in my journal yesterday? Help so-and-so, So I open up. In fact, that guy, a couple of weeks ago, I get a text message from him one morning. He said, what's that verse you read to me? Because today's one of those days I just need to be encouraged. because of where my heart is. What's the solution for this? What's the solution for our insecurities and for our self-loathing, for our never measuring up? So what you and I need is a God who is larger than our heart's imagination. It's fascinating because 1 John chapter 3, verse 20, these powerful words, this is what John says. He says, "For whenever our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart, and he knows everything." If our hearts condemn us, God is greater than our hearts. What does this mean? It means our hearts are going to condemn us. It means there are going to be mornings when I wake up and I start self-loathing, and when you start feeling guilty, or you start feeling shame, or you feel like you're less than, or you feel like you're unloved. And it says that when our hearts, the deepest root of our being, seem to be affirming all of these suspicions that we've had, God enters in and says, "No, that is not who you are. And you are loved, and you have a purpose, and there's more for your life than this." Do you realize that that is impossible for God to do unless God is greater than your heart? If God is confined to your heart's imagination, that can't happen. There has to be a God who is real and who is there for this to happen in your life. Which means this: unless you and I have a God who in some ways and in some circumstances tells us what we need to hear, but maybe not what we want to hear, then we don't have that kind of God. Unless you have a God that can disagree with you or contradict you, then your God is no bigger than your heart. See, it's only if you have a God who can tell you who you are and what you need, who can tell you that you're loved when you don't feel loved, only then can these things happen. God cannot be greater than your heart if he's just a construction of your heart. We need him to be greater than our desires. So one of the ingredients of conversion that we see in Saul, that we see in all people, is they begin to deal with a God who is really there, a God who is larger than what they ever imagined, more complex and sometimes contradictory to what they hope. When you're converted, you get a sense of who God really is, and your understanding of him expands beyond your own personal ideas of him. There's this collision. C.S. Lewis, when he talks about his conversion experience, he said it was like a mouse searching for a cat. That when he found God, he realized that mice don't chase cats. Cats chase mice, and the story was far bigger than he ever imagined. When we find God, when in our search we find God, and we really find God, we realize that God found us, and he's been searching for us, and he is far more large and complex than what we thought we would discover. There's a collision. God is bigger than I thought. That's what Paul is facing here. And then we see the next ingredient. What happens next in verse 6? Jesus says to him, "But rise and enter the city, and you'll be told what you're to do." And the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus, and for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. Now, a lot of people interpret Saul's conversion as a very sudden event. And based on what we're reading here, I don't really believe, and I'm not convinced that it was sudden. It is dramatic. It's very dramatic. We can be convinced of this. But I'm not convinced that it's sudden. He has this collision. And then, like so many other people's stories, he enters into this next ingredient, this next phase or stage of conversion. He enters into what I would call a darkness. Notice this. In fact, he enters into a very literal, physical darkness, right? He is blinded. But notice that Jesus meets him and he doesn't say, "All right, Saul, here's what you need to do. You need to get on your knees, and there's this little prayer that I'm going to pray, and I want you to repeat after me." And then, he doesn't do this. There's no formula here, right? No, in fact, he plunges Saul into darkness. He goes into the city, says, "You're going to be blinded." You go into the city. And Jesus, it's like Jesus is saying, "I'll catch up with you in a few days." Like, now that you've seen who I am, there's probably some stuff you need to spend some time considering. And so he's blinded. He's in a city that he's unfamiliar with. He's not eating. He's not drinking. If you're not eating, you're not drinking, and you can't see anything, in a culture like that, what do you think you're left to do? Think a lot, right? Like me in Montana, right? You're just like left alone with yourself, right? So he's thinking. He's in darkness to think. And because Paul, the Apostle Paul, who in this story is referred to as Saul, because he is one of the more prolific writers of the New Testament, we actually have some indication that describe what he was experiencing during this darkness. And there are basically two things that we know happened in his conversion. First of all, he's rethinking his entire understanding of who God is by going back to the scriptures and seeing things that he'd never seen before. And it's really important for us to understand this. The moment that he's confronted by Jesus on this road, an entirely new reality of who the Messiah could be or would be was now made known to him. The whole Jewish construct was built around the idea of the Messiah. And as a Pharisee, he had assumed that the Messiah would be blessed and not cursed. He had assumed that the Messiah would be powerful. And so this Jesus, who was supposedly the Messiah and dies on a tree and is cursed and not blessed, certainly could not be the Messiah. But when he sees him and he realizes, oh, this guy I thought was dead is not dead, it confronts his understanding. When he sees him face to face, his assumptions are confronted. If Jesus was raised from the dead, then Jesus was victorious, Jesus was strong, and Jesus was vindicated. Which also must mean that on that cross, he was not there because of his own curse that was upon him. It wasn't his own sins, but that he was cursed and abandoned for someone else's sake. And so in this moment, he begins to see the Messiah for who he is, and he begins to see the rescue of Jesus. And because of this, it's like the Bible, he goes back to it, and everything begins to look new. All kinds of things make sense that never made sense before. He starts seeing connections. He starts seeing foreshadowing. For example, he would have gone back, obviously, to the book of Isaiah. Saul is a Jewish scholar. He is a Pharisee. He understands the Old Testament backwards and forwards. He's memorized it. He knows it. And now in this moment, as he sees Jesus, there are things in just Isaiah alone that would make sense. For example, the book of Isaiah, the first section of Isaiah, is largely about a triumphant, powerful king who rules with authority. But the last part of Isaiah is about a Messiah who is a sacrificial servant who dies for the transgressions of his people. So Isaiah is this book where the Messiah is triumphant and a king, and also the Messiah is a servant who dies. There was always this sort of contradiction in it, but in this moment he sees and realizes it's in Jesus. He sacrifices and he finds victory. Both of those things are true. Or another example, and I just can't help but go here, the book of Leviticus. Leviticus, he would have sat in this darkness, and he would have been thinking about all of these years that we've been making. I mean, for centuries, we have been killing bulls and rams and goats and cute little sheep to cover our sins. Does a dead animal really cover, does it really atone for my sins? Or could it be that all of these sacrifices and all of these rituals were pointing to this? I mean, you can imagine, like in the darkness, hungry and thirsty, his mind just like, right? Like things are making sense. These are just a couple of examples of things that would have been confronted in his thinking. See, Saul believed that God was a strong God, that he would send a strong Messiah, and that strong Messiah would save strong people, right? If you summon your strength and you follow and you obey this strong Messiah, then you'll be blessed and you'll be saved along with him. Strong God, strong Messiah who saves the strong who obey. But now he has a God who sends a weak and suffering Messiah, who dies on a cross, and he saves those who are strong enough to admit that they're weak. And it's the opposite of what he ever imagined. Suddenly, when he understands this, everything looks different. And by the way, this is how this happens. Some of you have had this experience. Some of you, you've come into contact with the genuine, the grace, the unconditional love of Jesus. You've come in contact with the gospel in its truest form. And when you did, there were things that you found confusing in the scriptures. There were things that you thought, what is that even in there for? And all of a sudden there was like illumination and you went, now it makes sense. That's what's happening with him. When people get converted, there are things that never made sense before that suddenly do, specifically about God. Not only that, our understanding of ourselves changes. That's the other part of what's happening in this darkness. In Romans chapter 7, Romans is a letter that Paul wrote to the church at Rome. And in Romans chapter 7, he actually is describing his conversion experience. He's talking about what it was that kind of led to this. And so we get some insight into what might have been going on in the darkness. What's fascinating is he actually says that one of the reasons he's converted is the 10th commandment, which is crazy. Like, I don't know anybody that ever said, yeah, the reason I follow Jesus is the 10th commandment. Like, that one really got me. Except for Saul. Like, there's this crazy thing where that was the difference maker for him. Let me just read for you what he says in verse 9. He says, I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment, speaking of the 10th commandment, came, sin came alive, and I died. Kind of an interesting thing, right? He's talking about his conversion. And at first this is sort of puzzling, because when would Saul, a Pharisee, have ever been apart from the law? He was Jewish, he would have been born, he would have been exposed to the law all of his life. So what's he really talking about? What does he mean here? What does he mean when he says he was alive? Well, when he says he was alive, what he's saying is, I liked myself. I felt good about myself, right? My identity was intact and I felt good about myself. I had a good self-image. I felt like I was decent. I was certainly better than other people, because that's what we do. We compare ourselves to other people. And he's like, listen, I'm compliant with God and I'm committed to God. And so I felt good about myself. But then he reveals that he was actually keeping the law at arm's length until he came to the 10th commandment. Let me just explain what he's saying. The 10th commandment says, you shall not covet. And that commandment changed him like none of the others did. It challenged him in a way that none of the others could. Because the other 9 commandments, they all can be followed behaviorally. All the other commandments, you can actually engage in some sort of behavior, even though Jesus teaches against this. You can engage in some sort of behavior and you can justify and say, I did pretty good. Like, when was the last time you physically bowed down to some statue and worshiped it? Anyone in the room? Nobody, right? So we're good. So number 1, check. Haven't broken that commandment, right? So Paul basically was doing that. He said, I don't worship idols. I respect my parents. I go to lunch with them once a week. It's great. We have a good time. We talk about life, play some golf together. I respect my parents. Good. I'm checked there. That's awesome. Like, I've never killed anyone personally. I might have held the cloaks of those who did, but I've never killed anyone personally. And so he's like, check. I haven't done that. So don't murder people. Haven't committed adultery. Like, on and on. He goes through the commandments. Then he comes to the 10th one. And that's the one that gets him. Because you cannot do this with the 10th commandment. The 10th commandment cannot be defined on behavioral terms. Covet doesn't mean just to want something. Covet means to want something so intensely that there is discontent in your heart. So it isn't behavioral, it's something you feel. And Paul, what he's saying is that at some point, I could do all these behaviors, but at some point there was something in my heart. There was a discontent in my heart that was so robust that I knew I should be satisfied with God. I knew that I shouldn't want something else, but I knew this discontent wasn't supposed to be a part of my life. But I'm human and I'm broken and I have no way to resolve this. Maybe it was as he stood and watched Stephen stoned and saw the calmness over him as his life was taken. Who knows what it was, but something had caused him to realize in his heart he was discontent and there was no resolution to this. So Paul says in Romans 7, because of that, because I couldn't satisfy this thing inside of me, I died. What does that mean, he died? It means his whole system for how he created an identity for himself died on that day. And that's what happens in the darkness. That's what takes place. Now, again, let's be honest. Most of us in this room, in fact, I'd be surprised if any of us are building our identity on the adherence to the Mosaic covenant. Anybody? Like that's like where you find your identity? Like, man, I obey the 10 commandments and that's where I'm rooted, right? Probably none of us in the room, right? But what do we build our identity on? We build our identity on something. It may not be the 10 commandments. It may not be like Saul, but what do we build our identity on? Is it achievement? Like we just get to the next level. We just climb the ladder one more rung, and I'm finding my identity in that. Is it the acquisition of things? And I'm not talking about just things in general, specific things, where we tell ourselves, if I get this thing and I have this situation, then there's some sort of statement that it makes to the people around me that I have arrived. and that I have a certain kind of life and that I can be respected at some level because this has been done and this has been done. If you're a student, is it grades? Is it a certain GPA? Is it a certain recognition from your peers? Is it athletic achievement? See, there's any number of things we can build our identity on. And we feel good about ourselves because we're successful in these things. But the very best thing that God can do for us is to let those things unravel. Why? Because eventually they will. Eventually they'll unravel. Eventually there'll be a crisis. Eventually these things will collapse. And we'll realize none of these things that I thought would make meaning actually do. None of them gave me meaning. We'll grow tired of the distraction. We'll grow tired of trying to numb ourselves. We will discover the emptiness, and then we will have to face, like Saul did, who we really are. That's what happens in the darkness. He rediscovers God, and he comes face to face with who he really is, himself. He's humbled, and it puts him on the brink. There's this collision, there's this darkness, and then there's this final ingredient of conversion that we see starting in verse 10. He's in Damascus, and then it says that in Damascus there was a disciple named Ananias. And the Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias. And he said, Here I am, Lord, which he'll regret this in just a moment. And the Lord said to him, Rise and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he's praying, and he's seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay on his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. But Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man and how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who call on your name. But the Lord said to him, Go, for he's a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. So Ananias departed and entered the house. And laying his hands on him, he said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me, so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight. Then he arose and he was baptized. And taking food, he was strengthened. And for some days he was with the disciples at Damascus. Now this is a really beautiful story. Especially when you consider the tension that Ananias feels, right? I love that there's this honesty. Ananias literally is like, God, are you kidding me, right? Do you know who this person is, right? Do you understand who Saul is? Like, Saul came here with an arrest warrant and can take me to prison. Like, do you understand that? Do you get this? And Jesus is like, yeah, I get it. Go, right? That's the kind of thing. And then he goes. And it says that when he gets to this house where Saul is blind, he's hungry, he's thirsty, he's in darkness. He's had this collision with God. It says that when Ananias enters the room, he lays his hands on Saul. And I love the first thing he says to him. He says, Brother Saul. See, there's a collision, and then there is darkness, but then there is an embrace. There's an embrace. Starting this morning here at Summit, after our services, there's going to be people available after every service to talk with you if you ever want to talk with someone. If like you hear something, you say, I need coaching, or I want to pray with someone about something. There's going to be a team of people every week. And it's possible, you might have seen this, that when somebody's praying for you, they might put your hand on your shoulder. Maybe you've had this experience where somebody's put a hand on you while they've prayed for you, and maybe you've realized, like you've been disappointed like I have, that there's nothing magical about laying hands on somebody. Like, I remember the first time somebody was like, let me pray for you, and they put their hand on me, and I was like, oh, here it goes. Like, this is going to be like warm and fuzzy, and there's probably a glow. And then it's like, nah, nothing. Just like a sweaty palm on my shoulder, right? Nothing magical about it, right? Except when that hand holds your shoulder and that person begins to enter into whatever it is that you're in, there is this deep sense of, I'm with you in this. There's this deep sense of, you are loved in this. It's fascinating to note this, that psychologists have proven that, like this was an NBA study, like the National Basketball Association, they discovered that the winningest teams in NBA history are the teams, they did this by watching video, are the teams where the players touched each other the most. in a very appropriate sort of way, right? That's the teams that high five, fist bump, did the hip thing, whatever they did, they saw that there was this correlation between physical human contact and how many games they won as a team. There's something about this touch, there's something about this embrace that happens that says, I'm with you in this. Do you understand? Like, Ananias lays his hands on an individual who is responsible for the death of Christians, the individual who is known for his persecution of the church. He enters into the house and he embraces him. He puts his hand on him and says, I'm in this with you. And then he calls him brother. The significance of this, to say you're included. As he does this, literally Saul in this moment is experiencing a physical representation of the gospel. That while we were yet sinners, while we're in opposition to God, while we ignore God, God comes to us with his unconditional love and his grace, and he embraces us. And when we experience the embrace of God, and when we experience the love of God, and when we are included in the family of God, there is something that happens inside of our hearts. There's a transformation that takes place when we experience the unconditional love and the grace of Jesus Christ. It changes us. The embrace, the experience of God's grace is what ultimately changes our hearts and converts us. That's Paul's story, and interestingly enough, that's all of our story. As simple as it is, that's the story of conversion. So just a couple of questions for you. Have you experienced a collision with a God who is larger than your heart's imagination? Are you coming face to face with a God? Are you recognizing that God may be bigger than what you've imagined him to be or wanted him to be? Do you have a God who you allow to contradict you and disagree with you? Because that's the beginning of this process. Have you wrestled in the darkness with who God really is? Are you seeing things about him that you've never seen? Do you understand who you really are like he did? And have you experienced the embrace? Have you allowed, in the middle of all of that, have you allowed God's love to penetrate the darkness so that you could see and eat and drink and be strengthened as a result? That's what it means to be converted. Simple and still happening. Amen? Would you stand with me? We're going to close by just singing a simple chorus together. And then I'll come back up and close us in just a second. But as you go this week, may you know the goodness of a God who is larger than your heart's imagination. And may he give you more peace and more joy, more life than you ever imagined he could. Amen? Amen. Have an amazing day today, and we'll see you guys next Sunday.